Thank you very much for this kind introduction, and really thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great honor to be here, and that I can tell you a bit about my research. And I hope we talk a lot about negation, because I really like the work that's coming out of this lab on negation, and I'm looking forward to that. But today I thought I'll do a bit broader topic. So it's a very broad topic in cognitive psychology, I would say. And it's like the title says, it's about the interplay of modal and amodal cognitive processes in language comprehension. And how do I?
Here. You can even
use this.
Doesn't work. Okay, here.
Okay.
Now it should work.
Yeah.
Now.
It works? Yeah. Okay, so I would like to start with some very general comments on representational issues in cognitive psychology. And so if you read a book on cognitive psychology, a textbook, you will at some point probably hear about the following ideas. So concerning representational issues, the idea in the standard view in cognition is that you basically have at least two different kinds of representational formats. So the idea is that information that is relevant for perception is represented in one type of format. And then when it comes to higher cognitive processes, there's some transformation going on in the cognitive formats. So perception mostly works with sensorimotor representations or sensory representations. And then when it comes to higher cognitive processes, there's a transformation going on into more something like a symbolic kind of code. And then when it comes to action planning, there's again a transformation in the representational format. So in this, according to this standard view, you basically have at least two representational formats, and this is sort of indicated here in the different shades of green and blue. Okay. This is what is called the standard view in cognitive psychology. Now, people have criticized this view, and this is what is usually now called the grounded cognition view, by basically saying, well, we're not really sure that higher cognitive processes operate on a different format compared to perception action. Maybe there is, it makes more sense to assume that all cognitive processes are the same. They all operate on one and the same representational format, perception, cognition, and action. So in this case, basically the kind of format that the standard view assumes to be the case in perception and action. This is called the grounded view. And now if you look back, like in the last 30 years or so, in cognitive psychology, people have tried to find evidence distinguishing between these two views. And at least one interpretation of this endeavor is that both of these views are basically false. Yeah? They're basically not correct. I would say one interpretation of the results, if you look at it in a whole, would be the following picture. So basically, yes, you have two different formats, sensorimotor representations versus more symbolic representations. But these two formats play a role in basically all subdisciplines of cognition and also perception and action. So basically, you have two formats, but in contrast to the standard view, they do not collide with the distinction between perception, action, and cognition, but in any kind of subdiscipline of cognitive psychology, including perception and action, you will have both formats playing a role. So we will maybe call this the two-format view in contrast to these other two views. And indeed, basically, whatever you look at in psychology, you will find some kind of distinctions like this. So for example, just to give you an example, in conceptual knowledge, people would usually assume that a concept like dog might consist of a symbolic component where you have something like typical attributes of a dog listed, and then a kind of experiential component where you have lots of experiences with dogs and their features. Yeah? And maybe also what you can find a lot is that this is not a dichotomy in the strict sense, but it's sort of more like a continuum ranging from very concrete sensory motor representations on the one hand here on the left, up to some kind of more symbolic code on the right. And there have been lots of terms. If you look in different subdisciplines in cognition, there have been a lot of terms used for this distinction. For example, symbolic, analog, descriptive versus analog, or something like modality specific, modality unspecific. You find all sorts of terms. And in the following, like I already indicated in the title, the terms that I will use will be modal and amodal. So modal representations are more at the left side here, and amodal representations are more at the right side. And just to give you a little bit more ideas about what is a modal versus an amodal representation, a modal representation is basically very experiential and concrete. It is modality specific in the sense that it can capture information from different modalities. Like, for example, they can be associated like the sound and the smell of a dog, but there's no component in the representation that abstracts away over these modality specific aspects. And importantly, a modal representation preserves the structure of the referent. So it's very similar in structure. Typical examples for a modal representation would be mental images or representations in perception. Now, an amodal representation is more like an abstract description of a state of affairs that it refers to. It is modality unspecific in the sense that it might capture information from different modalities, but the representation itself is not modality specific. And importantly, it doesn't capture the structure of the referent. It is basically of a different structure. Am I loud enough? Okay, the side, okay. Okay, so, yeah, okay. So the structure is different from the way the referent is structured. And typical examples are feature-based word meaning representations, for example, or propositions. That's the idea. So here is basically an overview on this distinction between modal and amodal representations. So you see there's lots of experience-based concrete representations on the left side here, up to very symbolic representations, amodal representations at the right side. So, for example, something like frames or semantic networks or feature-based word meanings or propositions would be prime examples of the amodal representation. Okay, so this is basically just an introduction, I think, coming from cognitive psychology in general. There's this distinction between amodal and modal representations. There has been some kind of history. The standard view assumes that cognitive processes are amodal. The grounded cognition view criticized this idea and said, well, maybe central cognitive processes are more modal in the end. And what I would like to do now is talk a little bit about language comprehension in particular, because a very similar debate has been going on in language comprehension. There's also a standard view assuming that meaning representations in language comprehension are amodal. That's the standard view, propositional representations. Then people have criticized this view. The grounded cognition view in language comprehension became very popular. The idea that language comprehension builds on meaning representations that are very similar to the way we experience the world. And then lately, this view has been criticized with the idea that maybe that's not all. Yes, we find evidence for this grounded meaning representations, modal meaning representations, but maybe we also need some kind of symbolic component to explain language comprehension in general. So these are the three views, and I will now start with the standard view and show you a little bit of evidence for these other two views as we go along. That's the idea. The standard view, let's take an example sentence. The queen is stroking the horse. The standard view would here be language comprehension is a central cognitive process. It works by means of amodal representations. So in this case, we have mental lexicon with our word meanings. This is amodal, a symbolic mental lexicon. We have symbolic representations of each individual word, queen, stroking, and horse. In this case, we have some module responsible for getting the syntactic structure of the sentence. And both of these components, the word meanings and the syntax, they basically feed into some kind of module that tries to compose the meaning of the sentence. We have the word meaning, the syntactic structure, and this process now gets the meaning of the sentence by means of a couple of principles. I don't want to go into detail here, a couple of compositional principles. And in the end, what we arrive at is a sentence meaning in a propositional kind of format, something like this. Is stroking is the relation in this case, and it applies to the horse and the queen. So this would be a very standard way of looking at language comprehension processes, resulting in a propositional meaning representation of the sentence that is being said. So this is the standard view in language comprehension, and people now have criticized this standard view basically on the basis of the criticizing the assumption that language comprehension really is based only on these kinds of symbolic amodal representations down here. Rather, what people have said is that, well, and proponents of the grounded cognition view have said one important aspect of language is that when you first hear a word or acquire a word when you're a child, for example, let's say horse, you're often in the situation where the referent is present, where you actually see, hear, smell, and maybe even feel a horse, like this little girl here. And the idea now is that all these experiences leave experiential traces in your mind. And later on, when we hear the word in isolation, without the referent being present, they are all reactivated. All these experiences are reactivated. And these experiences make up the meaning of the word. That's the idea. And then by having sentences, we basically reactivate all our experiences, combine them into some kind of simulation of the situation that is being described. That's the idea. Now, if we apply this to our schema from before, then what we arrive at is basically this situation. We have a mental lexicon with the meaning of the words, but these meanings are now not symbolic components, but experiences, experiential traces left from experiencing the reference. Again, we of course have some kind of syntactic analysis, and these two components feed into composition, and what we arrive at in the end is some kind of simulation of the situation that is being described. Okay. So now what I would do now is I would basically talk a bit about experimental evidence looking at the assumption of this grounded cognition view. And in particular, I would like to look at 3 types of linguistic stimuli, basically one after the other. I will start with the easy case, with linguistic stimuli referring to concrete entities. Most of research has actually dealt with these kinds of words or sentences referring to very concrete, easy to imagine stimuli. Here, the idea is that comprehension basically consists of simulating experiences. I am reactivating what the words give me for experiences, and then I combine them in a way that I arrive at a simulation of the sentence meaning. In the second part, I will also very, very briefly look at linguistic stimuli referring to abstract entities, because this is an important topic in this whole enterprise. Here, the idea is that comprehension uses something like metaphoric mappings between abstract dimensions and more concrete dimensions. I will briefly talk about this. And then there is a third category that I find particularly interesting, and that is linguistic stimuli referring to concrete entities, but where we don't really have a lot of experiences with. So something like Jupiter or plankton. I mean, we all know what it is. It's a concrete entity, but we don't have our own experiences with this. And here the idea is, that's a very recent topic I'm interested in, but here the idea is that these representations, they get meaning by means of indirect grounding, by being related to things where we do have experiences. That's the idea. Okay, and I will start with this first category and basically look at 4 assumptions that are important, I think, for this grounded cognition view. The following 4 here: words automatically activate experiential traces. The idea that the word horse will activate all the horse experiences I have. The second assumption is that the experiences that are being reactivated are actually the experiences that the person understanding the language has made him or herself. The third assumption is that when you deal with sentences instead of words, you really combine these experiences into some complex simulation. And the fourth assumption is that these experiential simulations are actually functional for comprehension, in the sense that If you cannot simulate, you cannot comprehend. And I will go through this and just give you exemplary experiments on all these assumptions. And of course, there's all over the world, people have worked on this a lot, right? But I will focus on stuff that we have been doing in our group in Tübingen. Okay. We'll start with the first assumption: words automatically activate experiential traces. So the idea in this case is, again, let's take the example bird. If a kid hears the word bird, there's often a bird present, and in very many of these situations, these birds will be somehow in the upper part of the visual world. The attention will be drawn upwards because the bird is maybe in the sky. The person talking about the bird to the child will maybe point upwards. The child will turn the head upwards and so on. And the idea would be here now in these experiments that I'm talking about now is to look whether we find evidence that words like bird, when they presented without a context where the bird is present, that we still have some kind of evidence that all these upness is still present, right, in comprehension. That's the idea. So we, in these experiments, we basically make use of the fact that there are several objects or nouns in our language that refer to entities that are typically, not always, but typically up in the upper part, like roof, sun, eagle, moon, star, something like this. And on the other hand, there are words referring to entities that we typically find in the lower part, something like floor, foot, shoe, and so on. Here's a typical experimental setup. So we present words in colors, in this case, the word bird. And these words either refer to things that are up or things that are down, could be bird and shoe, something like this. And the words are presented in a color. And then around this word, we have 4 squares also colored. And the instruction for the participant is just press the button that corresponds to the square that has the same color as the word is written in. So in this case, you would need to press the upper button. And this would be a compatible trial because a bird is usually encountered up and you press an upper button. If it were now presented in orange, it would be an incompatible trial. And of course, the same would be true if you now, or the opposite would be true if you now present shoe in either blue or orange. Importantly, up-down is not very salient here because you also have left-right. And also there's no memory going on or any kind of, you don't need to memorize some kind of mapping or anything. You just need to press always the color, the colors change from trial to trial. But what we find here is a very typical result. If you look at it, so these are now just looked at this vertical dimension. If you look at the down key that is being pressed, then you see that response times are faster if it's a downward like shoe than if it's an upward like bird. And the opposite is true for the up key. So the up key is easier to press if it's an upward compared to a downward. So it's an interaction. And you see that the word meaning in this case interferes with responding to the color in the sense that where I would usually encounter this object influences my response times, which fits really well to the idea that once you hear these words, you're reactivating all your experiences. With birds, these experiences all have an up component. You look up, you point up, all the attention is going up and so on. And this makes leads to the fact that it's easier to press an upper button compared to a lower button. Okay. This is just an example. We try to, if this whole idea is true, then we should find these effects already very early on with children. And we try to manipulate the paradigm in such a way that it works with young children. The way we do it is like this. We present words via loudspeaker, the same words as before, shoe or roof or bird or something. And then we present a color. And the color is such that the kid knows that when red appears, he or she needs to press a lower button, and when blue appears, needs to press an upper button. So it's basically the same, it's just a little bit easier, this whole paradigm. And what I will show you now is, if it works, a video. Oh yeah, no, first of all, we see exactly the same effects. It's always this interaction. So although this color, the word that they hear and the meaning of the word is completely irrelevant to the task. I mean, the kid could simply look at the color of the circle. Still, the words interfere with response times of pressing these buttons, like you see in this interaction. And I will show you a little video illustrating this. And what you see is that these effects with kids are so strong that you really don't even need statistical analysis, because you can basically, by looking at what these kids are doing, you can see the effect. So basically, this girl that I'm showing you in a minute, every time she has to press a button that doesn't match the direction of the word meaning, she goes a detour. So for example, if you say shoe and she needs to go up, she would go like down, turn around, and then press up, which of course takes longer. Okay, that is true. I just filmed this setup because I wanted to have a movie of the setup, and later on found out that every single trial she's exactly doing this, so always going like detours. Okay, let's see if it works. So these are basically here the words with their translation that are presented, and blue is up. So this would be an incompatible trial. Floor up is incompatible. Crown up is compatible. Carpet up is incompatible, and high rope down is incompatible. Okay. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Did you see the detail? That's easy. Compatible. Okay. So I think you get the idea, right? It's a very, very strong effect. So if you can always also try it out if you know a 1 year or 2 year, or just say airplane, they will immediately look up. Okay, so maybe just to make this a bit short. So this was an example for an up-down dimension location, but we also find very similar effects if you look at the color. So for example, that tomato is red and broccoli is green. You find the same effects. If you look for body posture, something like happy and sad are related to a slouched or an upright body posture, you'll find these kinds of compatibility effects. You find it for the effector with which you usually manipulate objects. So if you have something like a pen, it's a hand movement. Stir up, it's related to a foot. You find these kinds of compatibility effects. We find it for sounds. Something like a dog does a different sound than an ambulance. And so this, I would say, is a very, very strong effects. You basically always find them. The up-down dimension is the strongest, but all these other dimensions where we looked at, we also find these effects. It's very strong. So I would say that it's clearly the case that words automatically activate experiential traces. I'm very confident in saying this with lots of evidence for this. Okay. Let's look at the second assumption, that these experiences are actually your own experiences, because this has been neglected in research, really. So I will show you basically two types of paradigms. One that looks at new words where we can actually manipulate the experiences that people have, and also one that looks at individual differences, because if it's your own experiences, then you should find differences between different types of people. So this is the first experiment. In this case, we basically taught people new words in the first phase of the experiment. So consider this particular example where a person learns the word mora, and mora is something that is always presented in the upper part of the visual field, and they learn this in, like, let's say, half an hour approximately, different words for different types of entities that are either up or down. And then in the second phase of the experiments, we use these words again in a similar setup as before. People know that a red word, they need to press an upper button, and a blue word, they need to press a lower button. And again, although they only have half an hour experience with these entities, what we see is again this interaction. So pressing an up button, because the word is written in red, is easier if it is referring to an entity that is in the upper part. Okay, so this again fits really well with the idea that you are actually reactivating your own experiences from this first phase. Otherwise, it's difficult to explain this kind of result. Then we looked in several studies, we looked at inter-individual differences. This is just one study where we basically presented sentences that refer to high or low tones, something like the musician played a high or a low note. Yeah, you can imagine these kinds of sentences. And what we did is we looked at a group of pianists because they have strong experiences with right hand is a high note and low notes is a, of course they sometimes do this, but I mean the usual experience is this. And we compared pianists in this case with non-musicians. So people who don't have any formal education in any kind of instrument. It's actually funny, Tübingen being a university city, all the kids are very educated. This is the most difficult group of people I've ever looked at. So finding in our surrounding, finding people who don't have any kind of musical education is nearly impossible. Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, so what you clearly see is there's a compatibility effect for the pianists, but there's none for non-musicians. Actually, just there's also some musical instrument where the mapping is different. The opposite, we also looked at those. It's not as strong, the effects, but you can also see that. And this is a very recent study on inter-individual differences, just to show you, because I was very surprised about this result. It's about opening and closing bottles. So if you think about it, opening a bottle is a counterclockwise direction, right? So if you open a bottle, it's a counterclockwise rotation. If you close a bottle, it's a clockwise rotation. And what we did in this experiment, we presented people with texts about opening and closing movements of bottles, something like it's about 3 in the morning and the bartender finishes her shift in the bar, she closes an amaretto bottle behind the counter and so on. And in another version, someone else, instead of closing, opens such a bottle. And what we do is people go through these sentences by turning a wheel all the time, and half of the subjects go like this, and the other half of the subjects goes in the other direction, either clockwise or counterclockwise. With the idea again that we have compatible conditions and we have incompatible conditions. Now, if we look at this, the critical frame is the frame 2, so they go through this in pieces, and as you can see, both lines, match and mismatch, are on top of each other, so there's really nothing. There's no compatibility effect, okay? But then my current postdoc, Francesca Capuano, she realized that these opening movements, that if you have a bottle, there's basically 2 ways of doing this. Most people have the right hand on the lid, opening the bottle, but some do it the other way around. And if you think about it, if going through the text with the right hand, if you have your right hand on the lid, then you're doing a counterclockwise rotation. But if you have it on the base, then you're doing the exact opposite turning movement, right? In order to, if you keep the left hand on the lid, what you do is a clockwise rotation. Okay. So she found out who of these people have the right hand on the lid and who have the left hand on the lid, and looked then at the response times of these 2 groups of people. And what you see is that in the one group, right hand on the lid, you find the match-mismatch effect like you would predict. And for the left hand on the lid, you find the exact opposite effect, which makes sense because they are using their right hand for making the opposite direction. So this is one of the, actually, I mean, as I said, I was really, really surprised to see these results, because it's one of the, I think, one of the very strong results looking into individual differences. It's we also replicated it. The effect is not very big. It's not very easy to get, but it was clearly obviously there in two independently conducted studies. Okay, so I would also say, well, this seems to be true. Experiential traces do stem from interactions of the comprehender with the words referent. Let's look at the fourth assumption. Integrating traces yields simulations that are consistent with sentence meaning. So basically, what is this about? It's if you have words like dog and basket in a sentence, like the dog is in the basket, then you might activate all sorts of experiences of dogs and all sorts of experiences of baskets. But if you really want to simulate the dog in the basket, you need to change sort of the dog. It needs to be in this kind of sleeping position. And you also need a particular type of basket. It probably won't be the basket where you store apples in. It's this type of dog basket. So it's about, this question is about simulations beyond the word level. So do you really take your experiences from the words and combine them in a way that you get a simulation of the sentence meaning? That's the question. Do you get the dog in the basket, in the right basket? Okay, and this is where negation comes into play, because negation is really nice in this sense, because you can keep the words in the sentence, but you can change by just inserting one little operator, linguistic operator, you can change the meaning of the sentence. So if we are using something like the lion is climbing upwards, then the lion is upwards, we have again this sort of upwards dimension in the sentence. But if we are saying that lion is not climbing upwards, we still have upwards and lion in the sentence, but the meaning of the sentence is nothing with up, right? It's also not down, but it's sort of definitely not up. So this is what we did in a very similar paradigm as before. So we presented these sentences, and then we gave them a color cue, and the color cue just says go upwards or downwards. And for the affirmative sentences, what we see is exactly what we expect, this interaction that I've shown you a couple of times now. The lion is climbing upwards, I like to press the upper button. The lion is climbing downwards, I like to press the down button. But with negation, this effect is gone, as you would expect. And this at least shows that it's not irrelevant what the sentence meaning is. It's not just the content words that have an effect here. You could have assumed that just the word upwards always leads to people liking an up movement, but this is not the case. The not is somehow involved in here. Yeah. Experiment. It's also where we wanted to look at sentence meaning. So we use these kinds of garden path sentences that you might know, something like, as Mary ate, the egg was in the fridge. People usually read it wrong in the first pass. They read as Mary ate the egg and then realize was in the fridge. Doesn't make sense, so I need to redo it and realize that as Mary ate, the egg was in the fridge. So we figured that if it's just the words in the sentence, then maybe you would get here activation of two types of eggs, the eggs that you eat on your plate on the left side and the eggs that are in the fridge on the right side. If it's just about the words in the sentence, then you might get both of these. But if you really only simulate, or in the end actually simulate the sentence meaning, then the fridge egg should be the one that you like more, right? The task here is just to say whether an entity of this type was mentioned in the sentence. So it would be a yes in both cases. You either get one or the other. It would be a yes in both cases. We have a control condition without a garden path. The egg was in the fridge while Mary ate. Again, it's this fridge egg that should be easier to process afterwards. This is actually what we find. So we see both in the garden path as in the control, we see a clear compatibility effect. People like to respond yes to the fridge egg compared to the eat egg, basically. Okay? So this fits well with the idea that it's not the words in the sentence, but it's the sentence meaning that actually plays a role here. And we did of course, you can say in both cases they prefer the fridge egg. Maybe they just like this egg better. So we had another control experiment where we used a different type of controlled sentence, something like, as Mary ate the egg, the butter was in the fridge. So now the egg is the one that is eaten. So now they should prefer this left egg. And this is exactly what we find. So in this experiment, although in both types of sentences, different types of eggs should be preferred, we see a clear compatibility effect. For the garden path, they like the fridge egg better. And for the control sentence, they like the eatable eggs better. And you can see this is basically evidence in a compatibility effect that you see. So these experiments clearly show that at the end of the sentence, people have a simulation of the sentence meaning, not of the individual words. Okay, so again, this assumption, it's not, maybe I could say we've done a lot of experiments on the sentence meaning. They are very complicated to get these effects because you need to always control for the word effects that are in the sentences. But if you try hard, you can find evidence that actually integrating traces yields simulations consistent with sentence meaning. Okay. Now, the fifth assumption in this case is more or less, I would say, the most important assumption for this whole grounded cognition view, because what they basically say is all the meaning representations are grounded and you don't have symbolic meaning representations. And this means that if you keep people from using their simulations, comprehension should break down. That's basically the assumption. We looked at this assumption, I would say, in overall maybe something like 12 studies with looking at different types of paradigms. One is, they are both indicated here. So one is that if you have people do some non-linguistic activity and then check whether this facilitates or interferes with language processing afterwards. This is one direction of investigation that we did. And the other one is that we basically occupied systems. For example, we had people press a certain pattern with their hand while reading things that are very hand related, and the same with the foot. And the idea would be that if you occupy this system, it's difficult for the language comprehension system to use this simulation system, and then comprehension should be worse in this case. Okay, as I said, I don't want to bore you with a series of null effects, but in none of these experiments there was even a hint towards any kind of evidence that this would be the case. So no matter how much you prime word processing with non-linguistic cognition, you will never find facilitation effects. And no matter how hard you try to occupy systems and see whether it has any effect on comprehension, there's nothing, simply nothing. Although we see the default effects that you would expect, we see all those. So it's basically the paradigms are working, but you don't see any kind of evidence for this direction. So my conclusion from all that we have done is that experiential simulations are definitely not functional for comprehension. You do it, but you don't need it. That's basically the and of course there are some results around in the literature that go against this, but we've tried to replicate all sorts of things. I'm just not convinced because we've never seen anything like that. Okay. Quickly, for the whole grounded cognition view, these abstract concepts are really important because, of course, it's really easy to imagine how you simulate something like Kaup or drinking or so, but how do you do it with freedom or imaginary numbers or all these kinds of law text, something like this. Here, the idea is actually that you make a lot of use of metaphoric mappings. Where you use, for representing something abstract, you use something concrete. And we've also done a lot of experiments with this. Just to give you an idea, for example, something like time, future and past. There the idea is that you use left and right. Future is more to the right and past is more to the left, or future is in front of us, past is behind us. These kinds of metaphoric mappings, there's lots of evidence for this. Also metaphors like an abstract concept like idea might be represented by illuminating something and so on. And another really relevant dimension is valence. Valence is a very abstract dimension, positive and negative. But again, here the idea is that you use space to represent this. Up is positive, down is negative, maybe because of body posture and emotions, something like this. But we also have, for example, positive is right and negative is left because of the fluency of our right hand, if we are a right-hander. So all these spatial metaphors are used, especially for valence and time. And just to give you an idea how we would look at this. So for example, in this case, we again have words that refer to things that are nice, that are pleasant, that are positive, something like cake, love, joyful, excited, sun, whatever, and things that are negative, something like rain, gun, hate, and so on. And what we do is we present these words to participants, and we, for example, tell them, if it is a positive word, press the right key. If it is a negative word, press the left key, or the opposite. If it's a positive word, press the left key. If it's a negative word, press the right key. And what we see is a clear interaction effect again. So people like the combination positive right and negative left, but they don't like the opposite direction. If you cross the hands, it goes with the hand, not with the space, which is maybe just an interesting side effect. And this holds for right-handers. Exact opposite is true for left-handers, which is interesting, and again relates to this inter-individual differences or your own experiences kind of idea that I talked about before. So these kinds of effects you will see with a lot of abstract dimension. In this case, it's just valence, just to give you an illustration. But I would now actually turn to this third category, because this has not received a lot of attention in the literature, although I think it is really relevant, because there's lots of concrete entities where we don't have any experiences, really. We know what they are, we know what the words mean, like Jupiter or plankton is the examples that I gave before, but we don't really know how this grounding, if this is really the only meaning representation we have, then how are these words grounded? And one idea is that they might get grounded by being connected to words where we have experiences. And I would like to call this process indirect grounding. And I will give you an idea on how we try to look at this, but maybe first motivate it a bit. What could indirect grounding be? So basically, what happens with words where we do not have direct experiences? The idea is that here maybe there's indirect grounding going on via linguistic experiences. And I would like to go back to this idea from grounded cognition, where it was said that, well, if you hear the word horse, you are usually in a situation where the horse is present and you have all these experiences. But of course, usually words are not presented in isolation to a child, for example, but there's lots of other linguistic experiences going on as well that we haven't looked at before. So for example, this might lead to the grounding of horse in experiences, of course, but maybe I hear a sentence as a kid, like something like horse riding is dangerous. And in this case, I would maybe associate the words riding and horse simply by my linguistic experiences. Or I might hear your brother wants a horse and a pony and associate pony and horse, something like this. At the farm, there's a bull and a horse, and I now maybe associate these words with each other. And for some of them, I might have experiences because I've been at a farm as a child, for example, with horses, ponies, and bull could be the case. But now what happens if I learn a word where I don't have these experiences? For example, a cow is similar to a bull, but female, something like this. The idea would now be that I build in this word cow in my linguistic experiences, and I don't have any direct experiences for this word, but simply by having these connections to these other words, and some of them are grounded, I get some kind of indirect grounding of this cow. That's the idea. Okay. So basically, this view now realizes that we don't only have a lot of non-linguistic experiences that accompany word learning, but we also have a lot of linguistic experiences accompanying word learning, and maybe these are really relevant also. So we looked at this indirect grounding in this kind of experiment here. It's an experiment together with Art Glenberg. And what we did is we came up with new concepts and we gave words for these concepts. So for example, the words Mende and Zeige in German, I don't know how to pronounce this in English. So for example, this Mende could be some kind of a head in which a very thin net of electrodes is implanted. People with a Mende can interact directly with electronic devices and so on. You get the idea, I think. And a Zeige could be some kind of a biomechanical foot that was initially developed to replace amputated feet and is equipped with high-performing mechanical muscles and so on. People learn these kinds of concepts until, several of them, until they really know what it is. And then in the second phase, we give them sentences like this one, you scratch your mende. And these sentences either make sense when you know the concept, or they don't make sense. So for example, you couldn't scratch your mende, but you cannot eat your mende. It doesn't make sense. So, and the task of the people is to say, yes, this sentence makes sense, or no, this sentence doesn't make sense. And for doing that, we use our response device. For example, saying yes means pressing an upper button, and saying no means pressing a lower button, or the other way around. And the concepts are always such that they are more related to an up concept or to a down concept. And now the question is, if you respond to these sentences, can you do this more easily if the concept that is in there is an up concept or a down concept? And remember, you don't have any experiences with these words, you just learned them via linguistic experiences. And these are the results. So you see a small but significant congruency effect. On the right is the congruent, on the left is the incongruent. And what you see is that the incongruent responses take longer than the congruent responses. So what you see is that, at least that will be our interpretation, that these kinds of new concepts, they inherit basically the grounding of the concepts where we do have experiences with, and we would call this indirect grounding. Just as a side remark, this kind of paradigm only works if you require very deep processing. So we give them sentences, and they are supposed to look whether it makes sense or not. It's a very strong processing involved here. If we only do it with colors like before, we don't get any kind of effects like this. Okay. So yes, we would say there seems to be something going on like indirect grounding. And I would like to wrap up now. So where does this leave us? So I would say the grounded cognition view that assumes only modal representations, both at the word level as at the sentence level. This grounded view cannot really deal with the evidence that we didn't find that if you, oh no, I forgot this slide, if you cross out these components, comprehension doesn't break down, so it's not very convincing that this should be the whole picture. Rather, what we need is basically both at the word level and at the sentence level, we need something like amodal representations in addition. So you basically see we have at the word level, we have these experiences, but we also have our symbolic components. And also after composition has been going on, we have a amodal representation for sentence meaning and also the simulation of sentence meaning in this picture. Okay? And then we said, well, this picture doesn't really take into account all these linguistic experiences that we also have. And so I think we should include them as well. So as you can see here, just to indicate it a little bit, we have linguistic experiences and non-linguistic experiences with our words. And these components, again, go through the comprehension module. We get a propositional representation of sentence meaning, but also a simulation of sentence meaning. And what you can see is there's basically different routes in this kind of model, how to arrive at sentence meaning representations. For example, you could go an amodal route, get a propositional representation, and then only after that build your simulation of sentence meaning. Or the alternative would be to go through composition directly to this simulation of sentence meaning. On the basis of our results, I would say in the whole literature, there is no way we can distinguish between this. We don't really know, even if we find evidence as we did for this kind of sentence-based simulation, we don't know whether it is really arrived at through this route directly, or whether we always need to have a modal symbolic kind of representation first and then use this to come up with this other representation. This is basically future research, and I've thought about this a lot and haven't yet really come up with any kind of good idea how to test it. So if anyone has an idea, I would be interested.